Alrighty guys, let's go ahead and get started. This is our last video. So in this video, we're going to go through all of the lobes and functional areas of our cerebrum. We're going to go through our limbic system, our basal ganglia, and talk about our cranial nerves. Lots of clinical connections in here as well, so let's get started. So your cerebrum, this is the part of the brain that when you think of brain, this is what you're thinking of. This is where you exist. Both this is where your personality is. It's also where your brain is interpreting, integrating all of the information and making decisions. The thin outer layer of your cerebrum is your cerebral cortex. It's just gray matter. And as we talked about in the last video, gray matter is where things happen. It's where we get integration. Your wrinkly brain, those folds, so like the hill part, those are called gyri, or singular gyrus. And then the indentation, the valley, is called a sulcus. So a small one in between gyri often are called sulci or a sulcus. And we also have a very couple large fissures that are going to be between big portions, like your longitudinal fissure that separates the hemispheres of your brain. So that kind of brings an interesting point. Your cerebrum, we have our gyri, our sulci, and then we have this big longitudinal fissure. And you can see that most of your brain, we've cut away the top portion here, is not connected to itself. The interconnection between the right and left hemispheres all goes through one place called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is where you have the communication from the right and left halves of the brain. And we'll talk about the different tracks that are happening here a little bit later on. In lab, you guys are going to be responsible for learning a lot of the gyri and sulci and fissures, but for lecture, we're just going to be focusing a lot more on really detailed function. A lot of these functions you're also going to be responsible for lab, so you're going to get kind of double dip. Now there are 4 major lobes to your cerebrum. We have our anterior frontal lobe, followed by the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. And oh my gosh, those sound very similar to the bones that overlay them. In between, sort of the line of demarcation of the frontal lobe and parietal lobe, is our central sulcus. And anterior to the central sulcus is a very important gyrus called the precentral gyrus. Posterior to the central sulcus is our postcentral gyrus. Within these regions, you are going to have maps of your body. And you can, for example, in the precentral gyrus, take an electrode and poke it, and that will cause a contraction of the muscle. So within each pre or postcentral gyrus, you're going to have a map of the body. And the precentral gyrus is going to be our primary motor area or motor cortex. Cortex and area are often used interchangeably. This is where we initiate our skeletal movements. The fact that I just moved my hand, that is all starting from that precentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is going to have your primary somatosensory cortex. This is where all of the information about, I just pinched my finger, the fact that I felt that is where that information is integrated at. So output, input. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look first at a lot of the sensory areas, and then we'll take a look at some of the motor areas. So in our brain, we're going to start off with the primary somatosensory area, or the somatosensory cortex. As I mentioned, this is a map. We call it a homunculus, is probably a good visual representation of it. It's a map of your whole body. And so where the information comes up the spinal cord, it goes through the thalamus, and then ends up at a very specific portion of this gyrus, is how we know where the itch is coming from, where the burning sensation is. Now in our occipital lobe, in the back, you can't see it here because it's primarily showing the association areas, but sort of in the folds of that fissure, you're going to find the primary visual area. This is where we have our initial integration of the visual stimuli. So when we go through our vision pathway, it's going to end in the primary visual area of the occipital lobe. This is why if you hit the back of your head too hard, it can affect your vision. Now the primary auditory area is going to be right around here in the temporal lobe, and this is where information coming from your ears about what you're hearing is integrated and you can understand it. Now within the temporal lobe as well, we also have sort of right here where the it kind of overlaps the parietal lobe just a little bit. We have Wernicke's area. Now we'll also talk about this in a minute, but as well as in lab. But your Wernicke's area is only in the left hemisphere, and it is primarily responsible for understanding language. So what that means is you guys are watching me speak, and you know the words that I'm saying. You understand them. And another way of thinking about it is those of you that are learning or have learned a second language, when you're practicing it orally, you catch yourself going, wait, that's not how you say that. That's not the correct way to do it. And you adjust. Or just in our primary language, if you go, wait, that's not the right word, let me fix that. So the ability for you to hear what you're saying or what someone else is saying and understand that language, that's all happening in Wernicke's area. Now, we're going to talk about aphasia shortly, but when this area of the brain is damaged, either from trauma or more likely a stroke, you can end up with what's called Wernicke's or receptive aphasia. And in lab, I have some videos for you guys to watch that really illustrates that. This is what we call word salad. So people that have Wernicke's aphasia, receptive aphasia, they are speaking in the syntax at the speed that I am right now, but their words make absolutely no sense. It is gibberish. They don't know that though. This part of the brain isn't working to let them know that they are choosing the wrong words. So that's why we call it word salad. Now, the two other areas I want to discuss in terms of sensation are going to be taste. So this is where the ability, that's chocolate, that tastes good. Or olfaction, which is also in the temporal lobe. It's actually kind of misrepresented on this diagram. It is in the anterior portion of the temporal lobe, but it's on the inside. So when we look at this in lab this week, you're actually going to need to look at the brain from the underside. So it's on what we call the uncus, which is this medial aspect of the temporal lobe. Hey guys, sorry, I had to adjust the lighting. So apologies if this looks a little funky. Now we're going to get into our motor areas. So again, motor is output. And we've already discussed our primary motor cortex. This is the map of all the skeletal muscles in your body so that you can initiate your voluntary skeletal movements. The two areas I want to discuss next are Broca's speech area and the prefrontal cortex. I will make a short mention that you guys will probably see something about like the supplementary motor area. That again is there to supplement. It's there to help with the like you've initiated a movement and it's there to help kind of modulate it a little bit. We're not going to talk about it too much in lecture. Broca's speech area is sort of the sister to Wernicke's speech area, but it's different. Broca's speech area is where you're planning to get the words out. What words do I want to say? Whereas Wernicke's is, did I say the right words? So people that have Broca's aphasia, again, damage to this area, usually because of a stroke, they are going to, I like to describe it as you've lost a lot of your vocabulary. So when you go to in your brain to click the word that you want to use, it's grayed out. Can't use it. You gotta click a different word. Oftentimes their vocabulary is much simpler now. And when you have conversations with these individuals, there's a lot of gaps in the words, like a lot of either no sound or filled with ums and uhs, but you can follow it. Whereas with receptive aphasia, it's very difficult to follow what they're talking about. And again, more on that in lab and video here and other videos in your lab lecture. Now, the last part I want to talk about before we move on to speech disorders is the prefrontal cortex. So this is the area right behind your forehead. And the reason I talk about this is because this is where you live. So you can imagine damage here from something like a bike accident, or slipping and hitting your head in the shower, or hitting your head on the steering wheel or the dashboard, it can damage this part of the brain. This is where your personality is, your mood, and your executive function. So I like to talk about this because as a nurse, you need to understand what could be going on with your patient in terms of what may happen later on down the line, or maybe if they wake up from whatever they're dealing with. But it's also really important to talk to the patients about it, of like, okay, this is why you're noticing these changes in your loved one, because this is where that aspect of them is found and it was damaged in that accident. Now, we all understand what mood and personality are, but not everybody understands what executive function is. Those of you that have ADHD probably are aware of what executive function is, because a lot of us that have ADHD have really bad executive function. In general, this is basically, it controls short-sighted behavior. So this is where executive function is, I should not do this right now because this is going to happen later. I'm planning for something, okay? And in teenagers, and basically anyone up to the age of 25, this area of the brain is not fully developed. So this is why people in their early 20s and teenagers are often doing what we consider reckless behavior. They are getting their first paycheck from work and spending it all on, stuff that seems frivolous. Like, why didn't you just save that? You're the one telling me you wanted a car. Save it for your car, right? Those of us with, that may have functioning executive function think that way, but while it's still developing, it doesn't exist. So basically, this is allowing you to plan for the future and make better decisions. And damage to this area can basically lead to a loss of executive function, so blunted emotional responses as well, which means they might have, done, why did you spend all of your money on that? That makes absolutely no sense. You have to pay rent in 2 weeks. Or why did you decide to all of a sudden jump off a bridge or do something that seemed kind of reckless? And then they may have a emotional response, which is like they want to yell at you. Like, how dare you tell me I can do my own stuff, right? That's a bit of an excessive reaction to what's going on. And again, I relate it to, because I have a little 4-year-old, when you say, hey, no, it's time to stop playing that, and they just go, wah, and just like give a very, very, we call it a very big emotion for such a small thing. The emotional response isn't really matching what was just said. I just said, hey, why did you do that? You can get anxiety about it. This is a big thing with executive dysfunction, which is where your executive function doesn't work very well. It's very common people have ADHD. So executive dysfunction is, I know I need to do the thing. I can't find the energy to do the thing, or I can do the thing later. And then you start getting anxiety about, I need to do the thing, but I don't know if and you start, like, it adds up, it builds up. You feel like you might get in trouble if you don't do it right. And these are all issues that people deal with. So this is like a procrastination kind of thing of like, I can do it, I'll do it later. And then it's like you start to really get into like, these are all these things are compounding, and it really builds on you. So executive dysfunction can actually be very, very debilitating. So that's my little discussion on that. Now, let's move on to the next slide. Okay. All right, speech disorders. So I'm going to preface this, not an expert, but I do like to talk about these 3 aspects of speech disorders because there's some things that you're probably going to see as a clinician. And this link here is actually to a speech language pathologist that's actually in Oregon, and she does a really, really great job of explaining these. So we've actually talked about the first one, which is aphasia, which is it's basically you have a really hard time with your ability to either understand language or use language. And as I mentioned, in both of those cases with Broca and Wernicke's aphasia, this is usually due to injury of the brain, most commonly a stroke. Now, apraxia is a little bit different. This is where the issue is not with it's with more of the motor aspect. So your brain knows what it wants to say, but it doesn't know how to do it with the motor aspect, doesn't know how to tell your mouth what to do. So you might have weird sounds, your speech is slower, and you'll have inconsistent errors. So you might say, I believe the example she gives is like, instead of saying dog, you might say God or gob. But like every time you try to say the word dog, you say a different word. So that's what we mean by inconsistent errors. That's the biggest like ding, 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 it's apraxia. It can be in children, and typically if we see this in children, it's a developmental concern, and in adults, it's usually acquired, usually from an injury. Dysarthria means your brain is fine. You can understand language, you can plan your language, you just physically cannot say it. So this is also, again, very common in patients that have strokes and have maybe like right or left-sided paralysis. So if you paralyze portions of your tongue and your face, you're not going to be able to make the shape changes of your tongue and move it and move your lips to create the sounds for the English language. It's also, you want to think patients that have fractured their mandible or had to have portions of their mandible removed because of cancer. It's going to affect their ability to speak. So just these three things: aphasia, where it's the brain problem. Apraxia is also a brain problem, but we're focusing on the motor component. And then dysarthria is more of a physical, like I know what I want to do, I cannot physically do it. Alrighty, on to our last discussion on the hemispheres before we get into some of the cool stuff. There are functional differences. You've all heard, I'm right-brained, I'm left-brained. That is somewhat true. The left hemisphere does tend to have more of an analytical component to its processing. The right side has more of a, emotional or more creative component to it. But again, you are also having connections between both of them. So it's not just like only your left hemisphere works or only your right hemisphere works, or if you are more you're a better artist, that your right hemisphere is somehow better than someone else's. It's all about the wiring. So I do like to mention it, but it's also like, you can't tell if you're right hemisphere or left hemisphere by like crossing your fingers and what thumb comes on top. That's a whole thing. All right. Enough of the hemispheres. Let's move on to a couple deep brain structures. And we're going to start first with the basal nuclei, and I know I've been calling them the basal ganglia. That is because that is their old term, and that is how I learned them in school. But as we discussed in our nervous system lecture, ganglia is the term we use for collections of cell bodies outside of the CNS, and nuclei is the term that we use inside the CNS. So I like to put the old name in here because sometimes that's how you're just going to hear it and see it. Now, there are several smaller components to the basal nuclei, but we're going to focus on these three: the globus pallidus, the putamen, and the caudate nucleus. And then, of course, we had the functional connection with the substantia nigra. Now, these guys are super deep in the brain. We're actually not going to view them in lab unless somehow after I've recorded this video, we get a new model. They're super deep in the brain, typically only seen from a frontal section. We have the globus pallidus here, here's our putamen, here's your thalamus for reference, and the caudate nucleus is right here. Now, overall, they're going to, again, help with modulating your movement. But let's talk about what they do specifically. So your globus pallidus, this one is responsible for regulating your smooth and precise motor movements. So making sure, these are precise movements, or, writing is a precise motor function. Making sure those are smooth and not kind of jittery. It is the primary inhibitory, it has a primary inhibitory component, which means its main job is to say no. And prevent unwanted movements, which is opposite of kind of what the cerebellum does. The cerebellum is more of an excitatory function in terms of motor function, but your basal nuclei in general are there to say, no, don't do that. I don't need this. I don't need your left arm moving while your right arm is doing this. So for the most part, the entire basal nuclei are inhibitory, but the globus pallidus itself is very, very inhibitory. The putamen is also going to be in charge of just regular movements, and it also has an influence on learning as well because it does secrete dopamine. And the last one, the caudate nucleus, so this guy right here, this one's really interesting because it is going to actually, again, have a role in fine motor control, but it's integrating the information that you're getting sensory-wise about where your body is in space, and then using that information to regulate your voluntary movement, okay? Pretty much what happens is your cerebral cortex, right, that primary motor area, is going to send a signal out that says, hey, I want to do this, and then it's going to relay that information to the basal ganglia, who are either going to inhibit or excite it and say, do it or don't do it, okay? And that's sort of the main idea of what these guys do. They're sort of the gatekeepers of movement, letting your brain know yes or no. And this actually goes, if we go back to Parkinson's disease, right? We lose that dopamine in the from the substantia nigra, and that's where you get that sort of unwanted shaking and kind of shuffled gait movements and things like that that we see with those particular individuals with the disease. So when your basal ganglia don't work, that's where you can get a lot of those motor disorders with excessive movements that are not meant to be there. Now, the last region of the brain that I want to talk about is our limbic system. Super complicated system. We're going to put it down into one page. This is a very weirdly shaped structure. We'll take a look at it on the next slide. But it's kind of like C-shaped. They kind of sit like this going around your thalamus. And one of them kind of looks like a shrimp. We'll look at a couple of them in lab. But their job, we call this the emotional brain. So the four major structures we want to look at are the hippocampus, amygdala, the olfactory bulb, and the cingulate gyrus. So the hippocampus, you guys have probably heard before. This is the one that is basically your long-term memory. So you'll learn about this more. But we do have, we'll talk about more, but we do have short-term and long-term memory. So short-term is like, it's just got in and it's there. And if you don't transition it into long-term memory, as we'll talk about in a minute, it's gone. So that's why in our class, especially, I've been really, really trying to get you guys to take all the information that you're putting into brain and turn it from short-term to long-term memory. This is why, you can remember your home phone number from 30 years ago, or lyrics from a song from 15 years ago, but you don't remember something you learned in class last week because it hasn't been stored in your hippocampus yet. Now, anterior to the hippocampus is your amygdala. This is like your really intense emotions, fear, aggression. Like, it's a super crazy area there. It's very intense. And we combine memory and emotion here. So this is where you do something, there's your memory of doing something, and the emotion that was tied to it, good or bad. And that can lead to decision making and learning. So if you do something and the outcome was good, you're going to feel great about it. You're going to do it again versus the other possibility. Now, something that's connected here is the olfactory bulb. And smell can be linked to memory. So when you smell maybe your partner's cologne, you're like, oh, that reminds me of them. Or chocolate chip cookies, or the smell of a stew, and you're reminded of your childhood at your grandma's house. That smell is tied directly to a memory, and it's linked to an emotion, whether it's positive or negative. So that is one of the reasons why smell bypasses the thalamus, because it's tied to your limbic system. The last structure we'll look at is your cingulate gyrus, which you'll look at this in lab. It's actually the region of the cerebrum in medial, that is directly above your corpus callosum. And this one is also really important in motivation. It goes, here's what you did, this is what happened. Do it again, or don't do it again. So if you, like me, moved your entire house in Birkenstocks, and then the next day were covered in blisters, you're not going to do that again. But maybe you started studying for your anatomy test a little bit each day, and you got a really great score on your test. You're going to keep doing that. So this is kind of where that comes from. We're going to quickly talk about lobotomies, and then we'll go over to our next slide. These are not done anymore. A long time ago, 1800s, 1900s, these were often surgeries done that would target the brain, the limbic system, to basically treat mental disorders. So it would target the limbic system or just the frontal lobe, because again, that's where your personality is. And oftentimes patients, especially early on in mental institutions back then, once they had a lobotomy, they were kind of a shell of a person. They no longer, they were functional, but they didn't really have personality, mood. So they did this a lot with people that had, again, back then, we didn't actually think to try to treat the underlying problem. You can still see lobotomies today for very, very, under very rare circumstances, and it's usually to target the amygdala for severe aggression. But again, it is very rarely done anymore. So here is our thalamus, and that's our orientation. Here's our limbic system in purple. So we can see our little shrimp here, the hippocampus. Here's our amygdala. The olfactory bulb is actually just the bulbous portion at the end of your olfactory nerve. And then we can have our cingulate gyrus just above everything. So again, we don't really get into memory too much. If you guys have questions about that long-term potentiation and all that kind of stuff, we can talk about it in lecture. Here is a scan, and you can see your hippocampus here in red and your amygdala in green. And we're going to look at all of these structures in lab. All right, last thing to talk about before we get into nerves. We discussed early on that your hemispheres do not touch, except in one space, which is the corpus callosum. So we have three different tracts, bands of white matter. We have commissural tracts, like the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure, which are going to allow communication from one side to the other, so from one hemisphere to the other. Association tracts, which you can see here, they're running above the corpus callosum. These are conducting information pathways within the same hemisphere. Okay, so commissural tracts, we commiserate, we talk to one another, right and left. Association tracts, they only associate with people on their hemisphere. And then projection tracts, which we can kind of see some of them here. They're projecting into the brain, and those are the ones that are coming from other parts of the brain, like the thalamus or the brainstem. So projection tracts are coming from elsewhere. The association tracts are communication within the same hemisphere, and commissural tracts are between hemispheres. Okay. Last thing that we're going to go to in this video, and then we are done with the brain, are the cranial nerves. So both in lab and lecture, you are responsible for knowing what the cranial nerves do. In lecture, I do not care that you can point them out on a diagram. I will get you there in lab. It is recommended that you learn the names of the cranial nerves, not just their numbers. I will present both of them on a lecture assessment. Don't use Roman numerals. I have it listed here to know the Roman numerals. That's because in a lot of diagrams, they still use the old terminology of like using Roman numerals to write out the numbers. Please use Arabic numbers. I still have a hard time with them. So let's discuss our cranial nerves. Before we get into this, one thing that you're going to see, you probably already have in your lab packet, in lab, you are given the option to learn the simple function of your cranial nerve, like, it does motor function, or the more detailed function, which is listed. Lecture, you have to learn the more detailed function. So what is it actually moving, or what aspects of sensation is it carrying? Just want to make that pretty clear. So the first thing that we're going to look at are the first 4 cranial nerves. Again, cranial nerves are nice. They run from anterior to posterior in numerical order. There's a couple weird things that happen in this area, but we will go through that. So we have our olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, carrying smell, because this is where receptors are. Then we have cranial nerve 2, which has been cut off. That's your optic nerve, crosses here at the optic chiasm, and then goes back to the optic tract, which we'll talk more about in our last chapter. Cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 2, smell, vision. These next 2 are 2 of 3 nerves that are responsible for moving your eyes. In lab, we go into a lot more detail about the specific muscles that are being moved. Right now, I'm not going into that because we haven't learned them yet, but we'll be able to integrate all that information later. So your number 3, oculomotor, this one is going to help move your eyeball, because it's going to control some of your extraocular muscles as well as your upper eyelid muscles. And then the trochlear nerve as well, number 4, is also responsible for eye movement. Again, we will discuss that more in lecture when we get to the last chapter. I don't have it explicitly written in the lecture video, but we'll do that more as like an in-class discussion so we can connect lab and lecture a little bit better. Now, this next nerve is a really big nerve for all of my dental hygienists, so we hit this one really hard in lab and in lecture. Your trigeminal nerve is number 5, and it is our first mixed nerve. So it carries sensory information about various portions of the face back to the brain, and it also controls muscles for mastication, like your masseter and temporalis muscles. Now, this is a big nerve, and you'll see this on the models, but basically it comes out like this and immediately branches into 3 regions. We call them V1, V2, V3. Do this with me. V1, V2, and V3. That will give you the basic run through of how those branches are then going to run on the face and then subdivide into their various nerves. So V1 is going to be primarily sensory for your scalp, upper eyelid, and like this portion of your nose. Maxillary is going to be V2, so interchangeable there. It's going to be responsible for like this portion of your nose, of your face right here, the upper portion of the roof of your mouth, and your maxillary teeth. So if you've had work done on the upper portion of your jaw for like a cavity or something, that's why this portion of your nose always goes numb and this portion of your face always goes numb, because the maxillary nerve is supplying those teeth. Now, the mandibular nerve is also going to have a bunch of branches to it, including the inferior alveolar nerve and then our buccal nerve that we'll learn about more in lab. But this is supplying the muscles here to move your jaw, as well as your cheek, your tongue, and the gingiva and teeth of the mandible. So here again, you can see some of those branches. We're not getting again into all of these unless I get a really great model in lab that shows them. So this may change for lab. But we are going to be looking at things like the inferior alveolar nerve and our buccal nerve, as well as like V1, V2, and V3 in lab. And you can see the sensory distribution that each of those regions is going to carry. Now, there's also something called trigeminal neuralgia, which is where it's affecting this particular nerve, and it's incredibly painful. It can often be idiopathic, so we don't know why it happens, but I just wanted to mention that trigeminal neuralgia is related to this particular nerve. Now, cranial nerve 6 is our abducens nerve. This one's going to abduct your eye. We'll again talk about the specific muscles later. This is our last eye movement nerve. And then cranial nerve 7 is our second mixed nerve. It's your facial nerve. Now this is where there's some issues in lab, because when you look at this, some of the models, they only show like one branch, but it's actually two. There's two components to the facial nerve. So you'll see two branches and then your eighth nerve when you're looking at it on models or diagrams. But this one is important for, again, sensation in terms of taste. So the anterior 2/3 of your tongue. And this is the clinical component. It's super important with facial expression. So some people can get what's called Bell's palsy, which is where you have partial or total paralysis from the facial nerve. And reasons behind this, it develops often suddenly. I've had students before that have had Bell's palsy. One, it came on after she gave birth to her daughter. Other times it comes on seemingly randomly. One thing that you'll probably, if you do some research on it, I'm not going to hold you to it for your class, but the way that the facial nerve sort of exits the skull is it goes through a bony channel. And if that nerve gets inflamed, maybe from a viral infection, which is one of the ways they think this kind of comes about, if the nerve gets inflamed, it's in an a enclosed space that can't expand, and so it starts to compress the nerve. Nerves are divas, and it can lead to this paralysis. That's kind of one of the sort of theories that we have. Most of the time, it will come back, either over a period of days or weeks. You will regain function, but sometimes it doesn't. Now the next three nerves we have are your vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. So vestibulocochlear is coming from the vestibule and cochlea of your inner ear. Again, these are going to be transmitting information about hearing and balance. Glossopharyngeal, glossal tongue, pharyngeal throat. This one is going to be responsible for the sensation of the last third of your tongue, and it also helps with releasing saliva as well as helping with speech, forming those words with speech and swallowing. The vagus nerve is a big nerve, and you guys will talk about this nerve a lot in physiology. It's actually going to extend from the brain down the neck and into the chest and abdomen. So it's going to kind of go through the entire upper portion of the body. It has a role, again, in speech and swallowing. More details on that in lab. And it provides a lot of internal sensation about what's going on with your internal organs in your abdominopelvic cavity and your thoracic cavity. And the important component that you guys are going to learn about in physiology is this is a major parasympathetic nervous system stimulator to your heart. So one of the things that can be done if a patient has tachycardia, so a very high heart rate, is we can ask the patient to bear down. Pretend that you're pooping. So compress your abdomen really tight, because if you look at where this vagus nerve is, it's all over your abdomen. And if you compress it, it can trigger that nerve and lead to an increase in your parasympathetic nervous system, which for your heart lowers the heart rate. So that is one way we can try to get a patient to lower their heart rate without any medication. So yeah, fun fact. Now the last two nerves that we have are the accessory and hypoglossal. And your accessory nerve, we're down here now. So let's actually, before we get into these, let's recap. Olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, and then we go to the middle. Abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, then here is our glossopharyngeal and vagus. So now we're down to accessory, number 11. And this one's nice because it's also a landmark because it looks like the number 11. So the accessory nerve is primarily motor, and it's going to control your sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. It's important, as we'll see in our very last chapter, with balance. So you're getting input from your inner ear about your orientation of your head, and it sends information back out through your accessory nerve so that you can make neck adjustments to orient your head. And then we have the hypoglossal nerve, which is our last one right here in the middle. That's again going to conduct nerve impulses to help with speech and swallowing. Again, a lot more detail on that in lab, if memory serves me right, because I did a poor job of double checking these links before I started lecturing. This is a link showing a video of how doctors and different like SLPs and things like that are going to all work together for a patient that's had a stroke. Again, this is actually in Canada, so it might be a little bit different than what you see in America, but I really like this because she goes through, like, we're going to do a swallow study to see how much, like, which aspects of the muscles might have been damaged or nerves have been damaged from a stroke, and then like kind of how they have to adjust liquids and things like that. So if that's something you're interested, please go ahead and check that video out. Now, this is a lot of information for cranial nerves. So here is a infographic that shows you the specific muscles that are being affected or areas for sensation that connects to each nerve. I really love this, everything on one page. And then I've given you guys mnemonics. These are the same mnemonics that I gave you for lab of how to remember the order, which again, this uses the name of the nerve. This is one that I stole from the internet. It's very good. And then to continue on with the Harry Potter trend, I just made one for function. The function ones are typically boring, and I will warn you, you don't have to use these. It's okay. I encourage you to make your own. Be aware that a lot of the mnemonics for nerves are rather adult in nature, so if you're not into that, please feel free to use something else. But we did it, guys. That's it. We're all done with the brain. I'll see you in the next video when we go through the autonomic nervous system. See you later.